It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend alone in an old cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Montana. I'd been working non-stop for months, and I needed somewhere quiet to clear my head. The place looked decent in the photos online. Small, wooden, isolated, and right beside a lake. The owner said there was no cell service, but that didn't bother me. I wanted quiet, and I was getting it. The road that led to the cabin was a narrow dirt path surrounded by tall pines. The deeper I drove, the rougher the trail became, until I was crawling along, tires slipping on patches of mud from a recent rain. The forest grew thicker, darker, pressing against both sides of the truck. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt a small wave of relief. It looked older than it did in the photos, wood darkened by weather, roof patched in places, but it was standing, and that was good enough. I parked beside it and stepped out. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The only sound came from the lake nearby, small waves slapping against the rocky shore. The cabin sat maybe 20 yards from the water. There were no other buildings, no docks, no trails that I could see. Just the cabin, the trees, and the lake stretching out like a sheet of dull metal under the cloudy sky. Inside, it was simple. A small table, one chair, a twin bed against the wall, and a stone fireplace that took up nearly half the front wall. There was no power, only a few candles and a propane lantern hanging from a hook. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and when I set my bag down, a thin layer of dust floated up. It smelled faintly of old wood and smoke. That first night, everything felt fine. I made a small fire, ate a can of soup, and sat outside for a while watching the last bit of daylight fade behind the trees. It was so quiet it felt strange. I could hear every ripple on the water, every gust of wind sliding through the branches. After a while, I started to hear things I couldn't place. Cracks and faint rustling somewhere in the woods behind the cabin. It wasn't anything too odd, probably animals moving around, but it got to me a bit. Being that far out, alone, with nothing but trees for miles, it does something to your nerves. When it got dark, it got completely dark. The kind of black where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I kept the lantern on low beside the bed and fell asleep to the sound of the wind moving across the roof. I woke up sometime after midnight. The fire had died out, and the cabin was cold. For a moment I thought the sound that woke me was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. It was footsteps outside. Slow, crunching steps on the wet leaves just beyond the cabin wall. I froze. My first thought was that maybe a deer had wandered close, but the steps didn't sound like hooves. They sounded like someone walking, careful and steady. I stayed still, listening. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I stared at the ceiling, every muscle tense, waiting for it to start again. After maybe a minute, I heard it once more, this time closer, right outside the window. I didn't move. There was no reason anyone should be out here. Not at this hour, not in this weather. I reached for my flashlight and slowly pointed it toward the window. The beam caught nothing but the wet reflection of glass. I thought about going outside to check, but the idea of stepping into that darkness made my stomach twist. Instead, I waited. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, slow steps crunching away toward the woods. I barely slept after that. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. When the morning finally came, I went outside to look around. The ground was soft from the rain, and I could see them, footprints. Not boots like mine, but bare feet. The prints went all around the cabin and led toward the tree line before disappearing into the leaves. I stood there for a long time staring at them. My first thought was that maybe some hiker had gotten lost, but the nearest town was hours away, and there were no marked trails anywhere nearby. I didn't know what to think. I just knew I didn't like it. I considered packing up and leaving, but I'd come all that way, and I told myself maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I misheard the sounds. Maybe the prints were older than I thought. I tried to convince myself of anything that made sense. The rest of the day was quiet. I went fishing at the lake for a while, cooked what I caught, and tried to enjoy the stillness. But as soon as the sun started going down, I felt that same nervous feeling creep back in. The woods looked different at night. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound too sharp. I decided to keep the fire going inside that night. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a scraping sound against the back wall of the cabin. Slow, dragging, like someone running their hand or a stick along the wood. I froze, every sound in my body, heartbeat, breathing, suddenly louder than everything else. I didn't want to move, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the back window. I pressed my face close enough to see outside. There was nothing, just the pale shapes of trees and the glint of the lake behind them. The sound stopped as soon as I looked. I backed away, my hands shaking. The air inside the cabin felt tight, like it was holding its breath with me. I sat there for hours, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. When daylight came again, I went out to check. The back wall had fresh marks, thin, deep scratches in the wood. They weren't made by an animal. They were too straight, too clean, like something sharp had been dragged across the boards. I followed the marks down toward the dirt, and that's when I saw more footprints. Again, bare feet, smaller this time, almost child-sized. They led around the side of the cabin and vanished into the woods. That was it for me. I packed my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the lantern twice. I threw everything in the truck and started the engine. The sound of the motor echoing through the trees was the best thing I'd heard all weekend. I didn't even look back at the cabin. As I started down the dirt road, I noticed something through the trees. A thin trail I hadn't seen before. It curved off from the main path, narrow and half covered in branches, leading deeper into the forest. For some reason, I slowed down, staring at it. It wasn't on any map I'd seen. I should have kept going. But something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. The branches had been cut back recently, fresh edges, clean slices. I could even see the faint outline of more footprints in the mud leading onto it. I didn't follow them. I pressed the gas and didn't stop until I hit the paved highway 2 hours later. When I got home, I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The cabin's listing was gone from the rental site. I checked the address, searched online, but nothing came up. No photos, no records. It was like it had never been there. A week later, I got a call from the sheriff's office in that county. They said they found my name on a receipt for that cabin and wanted to ask a few questions. Apparently, someone found a truck abandoned a few miles from where I'd stayed. Old, rusted, half buried in mud. Inside it, they found clothes, blankets, and a wallet that had been there for years. The sheriff said it looked like whoever owned it had gone missing a long time ago. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual near the cabin. I told him no, even though I wanted to tell him everything. I just didn't want to sound insane. But I think about it every night. The bare footprints, the scratches, the trail leading deeper into the woods. Someone or something human was living out there, watching the cabin, waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I picture that narrow trail disappearing into the dark trees, and I wonder how many others have gone down it and never come back. It was early November when I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I wanted a few quiet days away from everything. No phone, no city noise, no people. Just me, the trees, and a wood stove. The listing looked perfect. A single-room log cabin, 10 miles from the nearest town, right next to a lake that was half frozen this time of year. The photos showed a clean interior, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced the water. It was exactly what I needed. The drive there took longer than expected. The last few miles were on a narrow dirt road, the kind that felt like it hadn't been used much in years. The trees were so dense on both sides that it felt like driving through a tunnel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping low, staining everything in orange light. The cabin looked older than the pictures showed, the wood darker, more weathered, the porch sagging slightly on one side. Still, it looked solid. I parked next to a pile of chopped firewood, grabbed my duffel bag, and went inside. The air inside was cold, the kind of cold that bites your skin after just a few seconds. I turned on the small propane heater, lit the stove, and unpacked my things. There was a faint smell of damp wood, mixed with something metallic, like rust. The floor creaked under every step. I didn't think much of it. Old cabins do that. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I didn't hear any crickets, no wind, no sounds of animals moving through the woods. The silence pressed on my ears until I started noticing my own heartbeat. I tried to read a book by the light of a small lamp, but the isolation felt heavier as the hours went by. Before bed, I went outside to look at the lake. The moon reflected off the frozen patches near the shore, and mist hung just above the surface. It looked beautiful but eerie. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a dull thumping sound. It was faint, rhythmic, and coming from somewhere outside. My first thought was a branch hitting the side of the cabin, but when I listened closely, it sounded more like something hitting wood. A steady, uneven pattern. Thump, pause, thump thump. I sat there for a while, trying to place it. Then it stopped completely. I told myself it was probably the trees moving in the wind, even though I hadn't heard any wind earlier. In the morning, I went out to look around. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost, and the trees stood still, heavy with moisture. Around the back of the cabin, I noticed something strange, boot prints in the mud near the woodshed. Not mine. They were older, maybe a day or two, but fresh enough to see the tread clearly. They led from the woods toward the cabin, then turned back. I didn't remember seeing them when I arrived. I brushed it off as maybe belonging to the property owner or someone who delivered firewood. That day, I went hiking. The woods were endless, dark trunks, fallen leaves, and the occasional sound of water dripping from branches. About half a mile in, I came across an old hunting blind built up in a tree. It looked abandoned, half collapsed. A few rusted cans sat at the base of it. I stayed out there for hours, exploring, but that strange feeling of being watched crept up more than once. Every time I stopped walking, the silence seemed to thicken. By the time I got back, it was getting dark again. The cabin's windows reflected the trees behind me, making it hard to see inside. I unlocked the door and noticed something subtle. The smell inside was different. The faint scent of damp wood was stronger, mixed with something like old sweat. I told myself I was just imagining it. That night, the sounds came back, louder this time. The same thumping, but closer. It came from the side of the cabin, near the kitchen wall. I lay there in bed, completely still, staring at the ceiling. The noise would come, stop for a few seconds, then start again. Sometimes it sounded like something brushing against the wall. I waited it out for over an hour before it finally went silent again. When I checked outside the next morning, there were more footprints. Fresh this time. They circled the cabin, stopping by each window and near the door. The ground was soft, so the impressions were deep. My chest tightened when I noticed that one of the prints overlapped the ones from the day before, meaning whoever it was had come back during the night. I walked around with my heart racing, scanning the tree line, but the forest was still. I decided to stay another night but made sure to secure everything. I blocked the door with a chair, closed the shutters, and kept the hatchet I found in the shed beside my bed. That night, the sounds started earlier, right after sunset. Thumps, scratches, soft movements just outside the wall. It was deliberate, slow, as if whoever was out there wanted me to hear it. I could barely breathe. The heater hummed quietly beside me, the only thing breaking the silence between each sound. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the small gap between the curtains. My stomach dropped. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Someone was out there. I waited for what felt like hours until the sounds stopped again. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The lock on the shed had been broken. It was hanging by one twisted screw. Inside, the tools were scattered, and the old nails and ropes that had been hanging on the wall were gone. Whoever had been coming around was now taking things. I thought about leaving immediately, but my car battery was nearly dead, and the nearest town was 10 miles away. I decided to charge it with the small backup pack I brought, but that would take time. I spent the rest of the day sitting inside, listening. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. The woods outside looked endless, and I realized that if someone wanted to hide out there, they easily could. As night fell, I turned off every light to make it look like I wasn't home. I sat near the stove, trying not to make a sound. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. Then the sound of the door handle turning, gently at first, then harder. I froze, clutching the hatchet. The handle rattled again, then stopped. I heard the wood creak under their weight as they moved along the porch toward the window. I could see the faint outline of a shape standing there, tall and still, blocking the faint moonlight. I didn't move. After a few seconds, they stepped down, and I heard them walk off into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as it was light, I threw my things into the bag, went outside, and started the car. It turned over weakly but finally came to life. I looked around one last time. The woods were silent, but I noticed something at the tree line. A small pile of wood and rope stacked neatly, as if someone had been preparing to come back. I drove away, heart pounding the whole time, checking the mirror every few seconds. When I reached the main road, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I stopped at a gas station in town and told the owner there about what had happened. He looked at me quietly and said the cabin had been empty for years before being rented out again. A man used to live out there alone, a recluse who disappeared one winter and was never found. I didn't go back for the refund or my deposit. I didn't even check the listing again. All I could think about was that whoever had been around that cabin at night wasn't just passing through. They knew someone was there. They were watching, and they had been getting closer each night. Even now, when I think about it, I remember that sound, the slow, steady thump outside the wall. It wasn't random. It was a rhythm, almost like someone testing how much noise they could make without me reacting. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night, if the car hadn't started that morning, or if I'd looked out the window and locked eyes with whoever had been out there. I don't go to remote cabins anymore. I don't even camp alone. The silence of the woods used to feel peaceful to me, but now, it just feels like something waiting, listening. I rented a small cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains last fall. It was supposed to be a short, quiet break from work. 3 days completely alone, away from my phone, traffic, and people. I'd been feeling burnt out, barely sleeping, constantly scrolling through emails. The idea of a weekend in the woods sounded perfect. The listing showed a small cabin next to a narrow dirt trail, surrounded by forest with a creek nearby. It was basic, just a bed, small kitchen, a fire pit, and a generator for power. That was all I needed. The drive there took nearly 6 hours, most of it on twisting mountain roads that kept getting narrower and rougher. My GPS lost signal halfway there, and I had to rely on printed directions from the rental page. By the time I reached the turnoff, the road was more like a rutted path of packed dirt and stones. It felt like I was leaving civilization behind with every mile. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches hanging low over the hood of my car. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge. The place looked older than in the photos, the wood faded, the porch slightly warped. But it had charm. Smoke stains above the stovepipe, old tire tracks in the dirt, and the faint smell of pine. The forest surrounded it completely, the trees packed so tight that barely any light reached the ground. I could hear the creek faintly in the distance, a low, steady sound that made the silence even deeper. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. A single bed with a wool blanket, a small table, and a propane heater next to the door. The windows were old and fogged around the edges. The walls were bare except for a couple of hooks by the door where someone had left a dusty raincoat hanging. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the quiet. I cooked a simple meal, sat outside, and watched the light fade until only the glow of the fire pit lit the clearing. For the first time in months, I felt calm. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The sound that woke me was faint, something metallic clinking softly outside. It was quick, then gone. I lay there listening. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no animals. Just that still, heavy silence you only get far from people. I waited a few minutes, then drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and found something odd. One of the trash cans near the porch had been knocked over. The lid was half off and a few cans had rolled out. I assumed it was raccoons or something similar, though I hadn't seen or heard any wildlife yet. I put the trash back, checked around the area and saw faint footprints near the back of the cabin. They were small, narrow, and pressed into the damp dirt, too clean and defined to be an animal. They looked human. That should have bothered me more than it did, but I brushed it off as maybe old prints from a previous renter or the property owner. Still, I caught myself glancing toward the tree line more often than before. The second night, I couldn't sleep. The silence felt different, heavier somehow. I kept thinking I heard faint sounds from the woods. Not loud, just occasional soft cracks, like someone stepping on twigs far away. I tried to convince myself it was deer or maybe wind moving through branches, but every sound came in slow, deliberate patterns. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. The small lamp by the window flickered. The generator outside sputtered, then steadied again. When I looked toward the window, I could see the faint reflection of the porch light. It swayed slightly. Then, just for a second, I thought I saw a shadow move past it, quick, too fast to be sure. I didn't go outside. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the door until the lamp stopped flickering. Eventually, I lay back down, though I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I checked outside again. The ground near the steps had fresh marks. Footprints again, clearer this time. They came from the edge of the woods, stopped right at the porch, and then turned back. There were also 2 empty beer cans under the steps that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there, close enough to the door to leave them behind. The strange part was that I hadn't heard a thing. That day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I followed the creek downstream for about an hour, trying to calm myself. The air was cold and smelled like wet leaves. The water was low, flowing over smooth rocks. I noticed an old fire ring near the bank, half buried in moss with charred wood still inside. Whoever had camped there hadn't been gone long. The ashes weren't fresh, but they weren't washed away either. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The raincoat that had been hanging by the door when I arrived was gone. I looked around the small space, every corner, under the bed, behind the stove. Nothing else was missing, but the coat was definitely gone. I checked outside again and found one of the back windows cracked open slightly, just enough to notice. I couldn't explain how I hadn't heard anything. The nights were silent, the cabin small. Someone must have come while I was walking. The realization made me feel sick. I checked the car, made sure my keys were where I left them, and locked the door as best I could. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I turned off the lights and sat near the window, listening. For hours, nothing happened. Just the faint hum of the generator and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Then, around 1 a.m., I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. The boards creaked one by one. My pulse was so loud I could barely hear anything else. The steps stopped near the door. I sat completely still, barely breathing. The handle moved slightly. Not a knock, not a kick, just a slow, careful test, as if someone was checking how tight it was. I felt every muscle in my body tense. Then the sound stopped. A few seconds later, faint footsteps again, moving toward the side of the cabin. I stayed where I was, gripping the edge of the table, listening as they faded into the woods. I waited until sunrise before moving. My hands were shaking when I opened the door. There were fresh footprints again, clear as day, one set leading to the door and another going toward the tree line. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while. I packed my things as fast as I could. When I went to start the car, I froze again. The driver's door was slightly open. I was sure I'd locked it. Inside, everything looked the same except for the glove box. It was open, papers scattered across the seat. Nothing was taken, but it had been gone through. I turned the key, and the car started without issue. I didn't waste a second. The drive out was a blur. Every turn of the dirt road felt endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind me. When I finally reached the main road and saw a gas station, I pulled in and sat there for 10 minutes just trying to steady my breathing. Later that day, when I got home, I emailed the rental company and told them what happened. They said no one else was booked nearby, and the cabin's owner hadn't been out there in weeks. They didn't seem particularly alarmed. They offered me a refund, but I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to forget it. Still, a week later, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the listing to see if it was still up. It was, but one of the photos caught my attention, a picture of the front porch taken at sunset. In the corner of the frame, partly hidden by the shadows, I saw the same raincoat that had gone missing hanging on the railing. I stared at it for a long time before realizing something else. There was a figure in the background near the treeline, barely visible, but there. The listing was taken down a few days later. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about it more than I should. I think about those careful steps outside the door, the footprints circling the cabin, and how silent the forest was the entire time. I've been camping since then, but never alone. And every time I see a photo of a quiet cabin tucked deep in the woods, I remember the sound of that door handle turning. Slow, quiet, like whoever was there knew exactly how much noise I could take before I'd react. I left that place behind, but sometimes when I park my car at night, I find myself checking if the door is open just a crack, like it was that morning, and I can't shake the feeling that someone else might still be out there, waiting for the next person to stay alone long enough to notice the silence. I booked a small cabin in rural Oregon for a long weekend in early spring. It sat about 15 miles outside the nearest town, tucked deep into a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I found it online. It looked quiet, simple, perfect for a few days alone. I'd been dealing with too much noise and pressure lately, and I needed somewhere far away from everything. The photos showed a modest wooden structure with a tin roof, a gravel driveway, and a small deck that overlooked a clearing. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive out there took most of the afternoon. The last half hour was a twisting gravel road that climbed and dipped through heavy forest. The trees grew tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The road was narrow, just wide enough for one car. There were no signs, no houses, no sounds except the steady crunch of gravel under my tires. I remember thinking how easy it would be to get lost out there if you didn't know where you were going. When I finally reached the cabin, the sky was starting to dim. The place looked older than in the photos. The wood siding faded and cracked, moss growing in the corners of the roof. The windows were small, fogged at the edges, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. There was a small woodshed beside the cabin, half full of split logs. The forest surrounded everything in a tight ring of silence. No sound of wind, no birds, no insects. Just that heavy, almost unnatural quiet that comes with deep wilderness. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean. A single main room with a bed, a small kitchen, and a wood stove in the corner. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine. There was a single photograph on the wall, an old black and white picture of a man standing beside a large buck, both long dead and faded by time. I unpacked my bag, lit the stove, and made something simple for dinner. The silence was strange at first, almost too complete. You could hear every creak, every pop of the firewood. That first night passed uneventfully. I sat by the window reading until the fire burned low, then went to bed early. The only light outside came from the faint glow of the moon cutting through the trees. It was so quiet that even the faintest sound, the stove settling, a log cracking, made my chest tighten. I remember thinking how far away help would be if anything went wrong. I woke up sometime after midnight to a noise I couldn't immediately place. It was faint but distinct, a slow, deliberate tapping sound, like something light hitting wood. Tap, pause, tap, tap. I lay there listening, staring at the ceiling. Came from outside, near the porch. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped completely. I waited for a long time, but it didn't come back. I eventually fell back asleep, convincing myself it was a branch moving in the wind. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. The air was cold, the grass damp with dew. The trees looked darker, their bark slick with moisture. I walked around the side of the cabin and noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the mud near the steps. Not boots like mine, but lighter, smaller, bare footprints. They led from the edge of the trees to the porch, then turned back into the woods. They weren't animal prints. The toes, the arch, the heel, they were human. I crouched to look closer. They were shallow, not old, and the dirt around them was still soft. Someone had been there recently, maybe during the night. My first thought was that it could have been a hiker, though I hadn't seen a single person on the road. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe someone was camping nearby. I tried not to overthink it. That afternoon, I hiked down toward the creek about half a mile from the cabin. The water was cold and fast-moving, and the forest around it was thick. I followed the creek for a while, noticing signs of old camps. Bits of rope tied to branches, a rusted tin can, a half-collapsed fire ring. Nothing fresh, though. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set again, and that same quiet was there, heavier now, like the woods were holding their breath. That night, I double-checked the doors and windows, even though it felt ridiculous. I sat by the fire for a while, trying to relax, but every sound put me on edge. The wind had started to pick up, making the trees groan and shift. Around 11 p.m., I heard something that froze me. Slow footsteps outside, crunching softly over the gravel. They stopped near the porch. Then came that same faint tapping again. Tap.
Top.
Then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. After maybe a minute, I heard the sound of the porch creaking, like someone putting weight on it. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and aimed it at the door, but I didn't go outside. I waited until the sound stopped completely. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the window, there was nothing there. The next morning, I went out again, this time with the flashlight in hand. More footprints. They led right up to the steps again, then veered off toward the trees. I followed them a few yards before losing them in the underbrush. Whoever it was had been standing just a few feet from the door for a while. The idea of it made my skin crawl. I decided to cut my stay short. I didn't care about the refund. I packed my things and planned to leave before nightfall. But when I went to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. It made a weak grinding sound, then nothing. The hood was cold, but when I checked the battery, both terminals had been loosened. Someone had unscrewed them slightly, just enough to kill the connection. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, realizing that someone had been close enough to do that while I slept. I tightened the cables with the small wrench from the glove box and managed to get the car started again. I decided to leave right then, but part of me wanted to look one last time around the cabin before I left. I walked around to the back, near the woodshed. The ground there was muddy and soft, and I saw more of those same bare footprints, overlapping, circling the area. Beside the shed, there was something half buried under a tarp. An old sleeping bag, a few empty cans, and a pile of dirty clothes. Someone had been living back there. I didn't bother checking any further. I grabbed my bag, locked the door out of instinct, and got in the car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees to watch me go. The road seemed even narrower, the forest pressing in on both sides. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and got cell service again. I called the rental company and told them what I'd found. The footprints, the noises, the tampered car. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back about what they found. A few weeks later, I came across a local news article online about a man found living illegally in several old cabins across that area. They said he'd been surviving off supplies left behind by campers and renters, sometimes watching the cabins for days before sneaking in when people left. He'd been caught after a property owner found evidence of him sleeping in a crawl space under one of the houses. The photo attached to the article showed a thin, sunburned man with long hair and blank eyes. I looked at it for a long time, and something in my stomach turned cold. I thought about those bare footprints, the loosened cables, and the faint tapping sound that woke me that first night. I realized that he hadn't been trying to scare me. He'd probably been watching, waiting, and when I woke up, he must have slipped back into the woods to hide. Ever since that trip, I haven't gone anywhere that remote again. The idea of being surrounded by that kind of silence doesn't calm me anymore. It reminds me of that feeling, lying awake in the dark, hearing soft footsteps outside, knowing that someone is close but pretending not to be. The woods still look beautiful from a distance, but I can't shake the image of those bare footprints leading right to my door and stopping there, like he'd been standing just inches away, listening to me breathe inside. I rented a small cabin in northern Idaho for a week last summer. I wanted peace and quiet. No neighbors, no phones, no noise. Just a place to clear my head. The listing made it sound perfect. A simple one-room wooden cabin, solar power, a well for water, and a dirt road that led straight into the woods. The photos showed a lake nearby, a small dock, and nothing but forest all around. I wanted isolation, and that's exactly what I got. The drive out there was long, about 2 hours from the nearest town. The farther I drove, the narrower the road became until it turned into a rough track of gravel and packed dirt. The trees grew thick on both sides, tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. My GPS lost signal halfway there, and I had to rely on printed directions the owner had sent me. When I finally pulled up, the cabin stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It was smaller than I expected. A single room with a kitchenette, a bed, a table, and a wood stove. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, and the floorboards creaked when I walked. There were old photographs on the wall, faded pictures of the lake and someone's hunting trips. The place had an old, quiet feeling, like it had been sitting there long before anyone came to stay. The first day passed peacefully. I unpacked, made a small fire outside, and walked down to the lake. The water was still and dark, with a thin layer of mist drifting across it. The only sound was the soft hum of insects and the occasional splash of a fish. The peace of it felt almost strange. No cars, no voices, not even a plane overhead. Just stillness. That night, I fell asleep early. The quiet was so deep that even small noises, the creak of wood, the rustle of wind through the trees, seemed louder. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint scraping sound. It was soft, irregular, like something brushing against the outside wall. I lay there listening, my heart beat loud in my ears. The sound went on for maybe half a minute, then stopped completely. I didn't get up. I just stared into the dark, waiting for it to start again. Didn't. I told myself it was probably a branch or an animal and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The dirt was soft from rain the night before, and near the back wall, I saw faint footprints, bare ones. The prints weren't deep, but they were clear. They started near the tree line and stopped right at the back of the cabin, close to where I'd heard the scraping. My stomach tightened when I noticed how small they were. Not childlike, but thin, long, like someone underweight. I tried to explain it away. Maybe a local wandered through, maybe it was old. But the prints were clean, and the rain hadn't washed them out. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Still, I brushed it off. I didn't want to ruin the trip by overthinking things. That day, I hiked around the lake, following the narrow trail that wrapped around the shore. I didn't see anyone or anything, just thick trees and the occasional sound of water moving under fallen logs. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was already setting. The woods around me were growing darker fast, and that feeling of being alone, really alone, started to settle in heavier. I made dinner, lit the small lantern, and tried to relax. Later that night, I heard noises again. This time it was slower, more deliberate. The crunch of footsteps outside. They moved along the side of the cabin, stopped for a few seconds, then continued toward the front. I sat up in bed, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped again right outside. My pulse was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. After a long minute, I heard a single knock. Not loud, just one slow knock. I didn't move. The air felt thick, and the only sound after that was the faint rustle of leaves. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, toward the trees, and faded completely. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between every tiny sound. When daylight finally came, I checked outside again. There were more prints in the dirt, fresh ones. This time they circled the cabin, going right up to each window. My hands shook as I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the underbrush. I looked around for a long time, scanning between the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the forest was still. Not a single sound. I thought about leaving that morning, but I told myself maybe it was a prank, maybe a local messing with visitors. It was easy to make up excuses in daylight. I spent most of the afternoon chopping wood and trying to keep busy. The quiet was harder to ignore now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt heavy, like the forest was listening. Every time I looked toward the tree line, I felt like something was there, just out of sight. That evening, I locked the door and covered the small windows with an old blanket I found in the closet. I sat near the stove, listening. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, I heard something new. Faint breathing came from just outside the wall behind me. Slow, steady breathing, close enough that I could almost feel it through the wood. I froze, barely daring to move. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. A few moments later, I heard quiet footsteps again, circling the cabin once, then fading into the woods. That was the breaking point. I couldn't stay another night. I started packing my things right then, throwing everything into my duffel. I waited until first light, then stepped outside. The air was cold and still. I locked the cabin behind me out of habit, even though it felt pointless. As I walked toward my car, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A small pile of objects near the edge of the porch. A tin cup, an old comb, and one of my socks. They'd been laid out neatly in a row. My keys were still in my jacket pocket, so I got in the car as fast as I could. The woods were dead silent again, not even a bird calling. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered once and died. I tried again, same thing. I popped the hood, and that's when I saw it. The battery cables were gone. Not loose, gone. Cut clean and removed. My heart sank. Whoever had been outside had done it during the night. I stood there, staring at the empty space where the cables had been, realizing how far I was from anyone. No cell signal, no houses for miles, and someone or something watching me from somewhere close. I spent the rest of that day inside the cabin, doors locked, barely moving. I didn't hear anything until late afternoon, when I thought I saw a flash of movement between the trees. Just a quick shape, pale against the dark trunks. I waited until sunset, then started walking down the road, the only direction that led out. I carried my bag and a small flashlight, following the path until my legs ached. It took nearly 2 hours before I saw the faint glow of a distant porch light. A man who owned a small ranch at the edge of the forest let me use his phone to call a tow truck. He told me that cabin had been empty for years before being rented out again. He said sometimes hunters or drifters passed through and stayed near there. He didn't seem surprised when I told him about the footprints. When the tow truck driver took me back to get the car the next morning, the cabin looked the same, except the porch was empty. The objects that had been laid out were gone. The door I'd locked was cracked open. Inside, everything looked untouched except for one thing. The blanket I'd hung over the window was gone too. I didn't stay to look around. I just got my car hooked up and left. That was months ago. But the image that stays with me most isn't the footprints or the breathing. It's that quiet, the deep, complete silence of the woods around that cabin. I used to think silence meant peace, but out there it felt like something else entirely. It felt like being watched by something patient, something that didn't need to make a sound. I still think about the person who left those footprints, who touched my car and walked around that cabin night after night, never saying a word. Whoever they were, they knew exactly how far they could go before I'd run. And I think if my car had started that morning, I would have left without ever knowing how close they'd actually been. I booked a remote cabin in the Smoky Mountains last fall. It was supposed to be a quiet week to get away from work and clear my head before winter. The listing said it was secluded and peaceful, perfect for writing and hiking. I wanted to be somewhere no one could bother me, somewhere far enough from everything that I could sit outside and hear nothing but the wind and the trees. The drive there was already unsettling. The farther I got from the main roads, the rougher the terrain became. The pavement turned into gravel, then dirt. The GPS lost connection about 10 miles before the cabin, so I had to rely on printed directions. The road twisted through endless woods, trees closing in on both sides. Every turn looked the same. For a while, I wondered if I had missed a turn somewhere, but then I saw a rusted mailbox leaning sideways with the same number as the one on the booking confirmation. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow, overgrown trail that scratched the sides of my car as I drove through. It was smaller than I imagined. One story made of dark, weathered wood with a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The forest surrounded it completely, thick and close, like it had been built right into the trees. There was no sound except the occasional creak of the woods or the faint chirp of insects. Inside, the cabin was simple but old. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. The furniture looked handmade. A rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was barely functional. A small propane stove, a few pans, and an old refrigerator that rattled when it ran. The silence was heavy, almost like a physical thing. The first day was peaceful enough. I unpacked my bag, walked around the property, and found a small path behind the cabin that led into the woods. It felt good to be cut off from everything. The air was cool, and the trees swayed slowly, letting patches of sunlight through. But even then, I noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. I didn't hear birds or squirrels or anything moving through the leaves, just wind. I told myself it was fine, that maybe the time of year had something to do with it. That night, I sat by the fireplace with a book and a lantern. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, uneven steps in the dirt, coming from the direction of the woods. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I turned off the lantern so I could see outside better, but the windows were just black reflections. I stood there for a while, waiting. The steps stopped completely. I didn't move for nearly an hour before finally lying down again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. There were faint shoe prints in the soft dirt near the side of the porch. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper, as if someone had been standing there for a while. I crouched down, studying them, but they led back toward the woods and disappeared in the grass. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost or someone was camping nearby. Still, it made me uneasy. I kept telling myself not to make a big deal out of it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that someone had been close enough to watch me from the window. That day, I hiked a few miles from the cabin to clear my head. The trail was narrow and twisted, overgrown in places. The trees blocked out most of the light, and every time I looked behind me, it felt like something was moving just out of sight. I never saw anything, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone out there. I didn't stay out long. By the second night, I was jumpy at every small noise. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sharp crack outside, like a branch snapping under someone's weight. Then I heard another. The sound came from behind the cabin this time. I sat up, holding still, listening. Then I heard something else, a dull thud against the wall. Not hard, just enough to make the boards vibrate slightly. It happened again a few minutes later, on a different side of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and shined it through the window, but the glass reflected most of the light back at me. I could barely see the edge of the trees. Everything beyond that was just black. I waited by the window for almost an hour before the sounds finally stopped. When I went back to bed, I didn't sleep much. Every creak or gust of wind made me tense. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Small marks on the window frame near where I had been standing the night before. Scratches, thin and uneven, like someone had been dragging a knife or a nail across the wood. There were 5 or 6 of them, deep enough to leave grooves. I touched them and the edges were fresh. I checked my car after that. Nothing looked tampered with, but I started to think maybe someone was playing some kind of sick prank. I decided I'd stay one more night, then leave early in the morning. I just wanted daylight for the drive out. That evening, the air was colder than before. The woods felt heavier, darker. I cooked something simple and tried to distract myself, but my mind kept going back to those scratches. When it got dark, I locked the door, shut the curtains, and kept the flashlight close. Around midnight, I heard something again. Footsteps, but not just one person this time. It sounded like more than one set, moving around the cabin slowly, circling, crunching in the dirt, then stopping, then starting again. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. I turned off the light and stood by the window, barely breathing. After a few minutes, I saw something move outside, a faint shape crossing the clearing. It was just a shadow against the darker woods, but I saw enough to know it was a person. Then another, both moving quietly, slow and steady. They didn't have flashlights. They didn't talk. They just moved around the cabin, almost like they were checking it. I stayed frozen until they disappeared back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound made me think they were coming back. When the first light came through the curtains, I grabbed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started the engine. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I just drove as fast as I could down that rough dirt road until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. Inside, I told the clerk that I'd been staying at a cabin up the road and thought someone had been prowling around it. He just looked at me for a long second and said, "You mean that one past mile marker 17? I nodded. He told me that cabin had been broken into a few times over the years, mostly by squatters and drifters. He said a few months earlier, a hunter found makeshift bedding and food wrappers in a shed behind it. Someone had been living out there, using it for shelter. That night, when I finally checked my phone, I saw I had missed a text from the property owner. It had been sent the night before I arrived. It said, "If you hear anything strange outside, don't go out. We've had trouble with trespassers lately. They usually leave when they realize someone's staying there." It made sense of everything, the footprints, the scratching, the sounds at night, but it didn't make me feel any better. The idea that those people were right outside, circling the cabin while I was just a few feet away, watching through the window without saying a word, that's what stayed with me. I never went back to get my deposit or any of the food I left behind. I didn't care. The drive home felt endless, every sound on the road making me jump. Even now, when I try to sleep, I sometimes think I can still hear that slow crunch of footsteps circling the walls. Steady, patient, like whoever was out there knew exactly how long it would take before I broke and ran. I had rented a small cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains for a quiet week away from everything. I didn't pick it for comfort. It was old, tucked miles from the nearest town, with no internet or phone service. I chose it because it was cheap, and because I wanted to be somewhere alone, far from work and people. I thought isolation would be peaceful. I didn't realize how heavy real silence can feel until I spent a night surrounded by nothing but dark woods and the sound of my own heartbeat. The drive there took longer than I expected. The dirt road twisted through thick forest, narrow and uneven, with potholes that made the truck jump and rattle. The trees leaned over the road, their branches nearly touching the roof as if they were trying to pull me back. The cabin wasn't visible from the main path. It sat at the end of a small clearing, maybe 50 yards off the road, built from weathered logs that looked older than anything around. A small porch sagged on one side, and a rusty metal chimney stuck out of the roof like a broken pipe. Inside, the cabin was simple. Just one room with a bed, a small table, a wood stove, and a few cabinets. There was no power, only a gas lantern hanging from a nail and a pile of firewood stacked beside the door. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and smoke, the kind of smell that stays in old buildings after years of being closed up. The floor creaked under every step, and when I set my backpack down, a thin layer of dust rose into the air. The first day was fine. I unpacked, chopped some wood, and cooked a can of soup over the stove. The air outside was cold but clean, and the only sound came from the wind moving through the trees. I walked down to a small stream a few hundred feet behind the cabin, following a narrow trail of trampled grass and footprints. I assumed they were from other people who had stayed there before me. The trail stopped at the water's edge. On the other side, I could see nothing but dense forest, quiet and unmoving. When night came, it came fast. The woods turned black within minutes, the kind of darkness that eats away all sense of direction. I lit the lantern and sat on the bed reading an old magazine someone had left behind. For a while, it felt peaceful. the fire crackling softly, the lantern's light flickering on the wooden walls. But around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. A few slow steps, then silence. I told myself it was just a branch moving in the wind, but the sound came again, deliberate and heavy. I froze, listening. It moved around the cabin, slow and steady, like someone circling it. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves, the soft drag of feet against the dirt. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I reached over and turned the lantern down until it was barely glowing. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, closer to the front porch. I could picture someone standing there, just outside the door, listening. After a few minutes, the sound faded away into the woods. I waited another half hour before I let myself lie down again. Every creak and groan of the old cabin made my stomach twist, but eventually I fell asleep, clutching the flashlight in my hand. When morning came, the world felt different. The air was cold and still, and everything outside was covered in a thin layer of frost. I stepped out onto the porch to look around, and that's when I saw them, footprints, bare feet. They started at the edge of the clearing and led straight up to the porch steps. The prints were clear and deep in the dirt, toes pressed into the frozen ground. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared toward the trees. I crouched down, staring at them. They weren't old. The frost hadn't settled inside them yet. Someone had been walking barefoot in the freezing night, right up to the door where I slept. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just endless woods and a thick fog drifting through the branches. I spent most of that day on edge. Every sound outside made me look up. I double-checked the door latch, even pushed a small cabinet against it. The place didn't have any lock worth trusting. Around noon, I decided to hike down the dirt road to where I had cell service earlier, but the signal never came back. The forest swallowed everything: sound, direction, time. It felt like the deeper I went, the quieter it got. I turned back before the sun dipped too low. That night, I built a bigger fire and kept the lantern burning brighter. I didn't want darkness anywhere near me, but the unease didn't fade. The woods outside seemed to move differently that night. The wind came in short, sharp bursts instead of steady waves, and the usual background hum of insects and birds was gone. It was past midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. I could hear the leaves crunching, then the sound of something brushing against the wall again. Then came a light tapping sound, 3 taps like fingers or maybe a stick hitting the wood. I sat still, breathing shallow, staring at the window. I didn't want to move, but I had to know if someone was out there. I turned the lantern down, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it toward the back wall. Nothing. I walked to the window and shined the light outside. The beam barely reached the trees. I saw nothing but empty forest and the fog shifting through it. Then I saw something move. Not fast, just a small shift of shadow near the edge of the tree line. It looked like someone standing there, half hidden behind a trunk. I kept the light on it, but the fog thickened, swallowing the shape. I felt my stomach twist as I backed away from the window. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, gripping the flashlight until my hand cramped. The noises stopped sometime before dawn. When daylight came, I went outside again. The footprints were back. More of them this time. They circled the cabin again, and one set led straight up to the window I had looked out of. That was enough for me. I packed up everything I had, shoved it into the truck, and started driving out. The dirt road felt longer than it did before. The trees seemed closer, leaning in tighter on both sides. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the woods behind me. About a mile from the cabin, I noticed something on the side of the road. A pile of branches stacked neatly into a small pyramid shape. It didn't look natural. I slowed down and saw more piles every few hundred feet, each one larger than the last. They looked like someone had been marking the road with them. The strangest part was that every pile had something small stuck inside: bits of fabric, a shoe, a piece of rope. Things that looked used, dirty, and weathered by rain. I didn't stop to look closer. I pressed the gas and didn't look back again. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner and tried to calm down. I wanted to tell someone, but what was I supposed to say? That someone barefoot had been walking around my cabin in the freezing woods, scratching at the walls and watching me through the windows? I couldn't explain it without sounding insane. That night, I checked the cabin listing online again, planning to leave a warning for whoever rented it next. But the page was gone. The whole listing had been deleted. I searched the address, the owner's name, everything. Nothing came up. It was like it had never existed. I still think about those footprints sometimes. How close they came to the door. How they circled the cabin over and over. I wonder if whoever made them watched me pack my things and drive away. I wonder if they were waiting for me to step outside again. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I looked up missing person reports in that area. There were several hikers, campers, hunters, all gone within a few miles of where I'd stayed. One report mentioned something strange. A local search team had found piles of sticks and branches near some of the missing people's last known spots. The same kind of piles I saw on the road. That was when I stopped wondering. I knew I hadn't imagined any of it. Someone had been living out there, deep in those woods, watching, waiting for people who came alone. And every time I see a dense patch of trees now, I think about those bare footprints in the frost and how quiet the woods can get right before something steps out of them.